AMD decided to show up to the party that Intel's been at about 1 year late. Though to be fair, Intel showed up to that party about a year late also. They're sort of like old friends who keep missing each other, except they're not friends and they don't want to see each other. So we're looking at the AMD R5 5600 non-X today. That's very important. It is specifically a different CPU. It's $200 for the MSRP. The X CPU has fallen in price more recently. It's about $230. If you haven't checked recently, that's where it is. It was originally closer to $300. Was a little bit of a controversy when it launched because AMD this time did not launch the non-X CPUs with its X CPUs. That was a big deal, and it was specifically because Intel had nothing on the market to compete with AMD. So welcome back, Intel. Thanks for dragging AMD along with you. We're going to look at the 5600 first. We have reviews for the R5 5500, 5700X R7 CPU, and some of the others like the R5 4500 coming up shortly. Before that, this video is brought to you by Arctic and the Liquid Freezer 2 line of liquid coolers, which tested among the best in our thermal charts for CPU coolers. The Arctic Liquid Freezer series has had continual advancement since our original review, with updates in the mounting kit, including an AMD offset bracket for better thermals, and a longer warranty. Arctic also has its MX5 thermal compound, available on the market now if you need some thermal paste for your regular maintenance. Learn more at the links in the description below. So getting started then, the market's really interesting now. The two CPU companies are really going at each other, but they're still gapped by at least 4 to 6 months, and in some instances about a year. The 5600 here actually is coming out about a year and a half after the launch of the 5600X. It's very delayed compared to the other X and non-X CPU launches from AMD. And that means that in that time span, we've had price reductions in basically all the 5,000 CPUs that AMD series, that is not, they haven't released 5,000 CPUs, but 5,000 series CPUs that AMD has launched in the time since. So to catch everyone up, the i5-12400 we think is the main competitor here. It's about $180 to $200 depending on when you look, where you catch it. The 12500 we reviewed recently, it's a little bit faster than the 12400. It's not worth considering though, so we're not really going to talk about it much here. It's $220 or so dollars. And then for the lower end stuff, you've got the i3-12100F. That's still our primary, very budget-focused recommendation. Awesome CPU for $120. The 12400 is pretty good. It is a good value overall for the performance versus the price, but really that i3 is where if you're on a strict budget, you can't stretch any higher. That's where you'll still get a pretty good experience with it. That'll last a couple of years. So that's what we're looking at. Now, for the new CPUs from AMD, here's how it stacks up. The one you need to pay attention to in this review is the 5600 non-X, which is a Zen 3 CPU. So the architecture is identical to the 5600X, the 5800X, and everything else that came out in the more recent X Series 5000 CPUs. Core and thread count is still 6 and 12 versus the 5600X, which is also 6 and 12. Now, where we see the changes would be the frequency. So the base clock on the 5600X was 3.7 gigahertz, and the boost as listed by AMD was a max up to 4.6 gigahertz. The 5600 non-X is at 3.5 gigahertz for base, so that's a 200 megahertz difference reduction, and 4.4 for boost, which is again 200 megahertz. TDP is the same for both, so they're both 65 watts, and then they're also both Gen 4 CPUs. And the 5600 non-X comes with the Wraith Stealth cooler as well. And if you're interested in that cooler's performance specifically, we have a really in-depth whole suite of CPU cooler tests. You can check our playlist on the channel for CPU coolers. Click any of the recent ones, especially for an air cooler. You'll see the AMD stock coolers in that listing if you'd like to get an idea of whether it's worth upgrading or not. That's a separate topic. So that's enough for the specs overview here. We'll go over the others in the next reviews. Now, a couple things to know. Big reminder, whenever we've reviewed the X-Class R5 CPUs in the past, so the 1600 versus 1600X, ignoring the 1600AF, which was a great CPU, the 2600 and 2600X, 3600, 3600X, we've always had the same conclusion. The title's always basically been X dollars for a letter. This time it's $100 for a letter. If you look at the original MSRP of the 5600X at about $300 versus $200 for the 5600 non-X. Massive difference, completely insane, but now it's more like $30 for a letter because the 5600X has fallen in price. That is still a lot of money to pay for a letter if that letter doesn't get you very much. But as we all know, X's are for gaming, and that means that they're better. So this isn't as if AMD launched a 5600B or a 5600Y, for example. No, this has the venerated and highly trusted and renowned letter X in it. It's accompanied in most of the motherboards. Of course, the X's have to be compatible. You can't use something that has the wrong type of X in it. So if it's got a double X, like XFX, for example, then they won't work together. I'm just joking about that. XFX stuff doesn't work. So historically, the X classes have not gotten a recommendation. That is probable to be the conclusion here as well, which means the 5600X should shape up to be hopefully a little more positive. Let's get started with it. The key focus, again, 12400 and 5600X compared to the 5600. Here we go. We need to start with the frequency testing for this one, since that's the main difference versus the 5600X. In a Blender all-core workload, the R5 5600 spiked to 4500 megahertz initially and just for one interval, so it doesn't really count. But then it averaged out to about 4300 to 4320 megahertz for the entire rest of the test. There's no frequency decay from thermals or power in this one, so it sustains at 4300 predictably. This is about 100 megahertz lower than the advertised boost frequency, which we've seen from AMD before, but it'll change once we get to Cinebench. For perspective, the R5 5600X starts at 4450 megahertz, fading to 4400 by the end of the log's duration, and because this is an all-core sustained workload, the slightly lower boost than advertised clocks is what we would typically see anyway. Max single core frequency is next. For this, we take the maximum frequency per interval as logged during one-threaded Cinebench passes. The R5 5600 non-X plots at 4450 megahertz for the entirety of this test, with the R5 5600X plotting at 4650. The base clock is a controlled 100 megahertz, so this is just extra scaling room from the silicon fitness quality and the thermal attributes. In Rainbow Six Siege at 1080p, the Ryzen 5 5600 non-X CPU ran at 476 FPS average, which positions it right between the Intel i5-12400 and the R5 5600X. That's a good start for AMD, especially if it does end up about the same price as the 12400 or the 12500. The lead over the i5-12400 is 2%, so not much ultimately, but a lead at matched prices is better than where we suspect some of AMD's other new CPUs will land, but check back for those in the next few reviews. The 5600X ran about 1% faster than the R5 5600, and those are also completely identical between them. Despite this rough equivalence, the 5600X costs $30 more. That's some expensive ink they're using to print the X on the box. 1440p is next. This institutes more of a GPU bottleneck at the top end of the results, so scaling is truncated, but it's also a realistic representation of the likelihood of a GPU bind that most people will face. The R5 5600's 345 FPS average allows the R5 5600X a massive, breathtaking 1.5% lead. That's $6 for every 1 FPS you're gaining, if you want to look at it that way, or a 5 FPS total increase, which isn't even remotely perceptible to a human player at this scale. Though there are some inhuman players who could probably see this difference, so maybe AMD is just building for that. Compared to the i5-12400, the 5600 non-X slips and allows the 12400 a lead of 2.6%. Not a big mix-up, but consistent with some of the past exchanges we've seen where GPU driver overhead can favor one architecture or brand over another. In this specific instance, Intel is favored more than it was at the fully CPU-constrained 1080p, but they've functionally just traded equally between the two tests. Cyberpunk 2077 is a higher load game than some of the others that we test. In this one, the AMD R5 5600X allows the system to run at 169 FPS average after a fresh retest, with the R5 5600 running at 168 FPS average. These differences are within error and irrelevant, as the end user won't perceive them. Compared to the 12400, the difference is also irrelevant. It's about 170 FPS average here. Lows are comparable between all three of these CPUs in the chart here, and so the main takeaway is just that the 5600X has lost significant value, or really any defensible argument for purchase with this launch. The 5600 now supplants the 5600X in the choice against the 12400, which is good because the 12400 made more sense to buy than the 5600X previously, so now there's more direct competition. On to a racing game for something different. We look at F1 2021 for this. This game runs at a very high frame rate when at 1080p, allowing us to see scaling between the CPUs. We don't have as many CPUs tested in this one since it was updated recently, so we've been rerunning the ones that you see here. The 5600X caps at 350 FPS average for the frame rate, with the R5 5600 at the same level, so they're really no different, or we're hitting other limitations here anyway. Lows are not meaningfully different either, and the 12400 runs at about 335 FPS average here, which allows the 5600 non-X a lead of 4%. CSGO is generally CPU bound and makes for a good benchmark that remains realistic to actual use. In CSGO, the R5-5600X ran at 332 FPS average, which has it leading the R5-5600 non-X by about 1%. We're basically within error here, very close to it anyway. The lows are also pretty close within error on the freshly recalculated 5600X. We've generally seen an AMD advantage other than the 12900K in CSGO. As a result, the 5600 non-X leads just about everything from Intel previously, or at least everything relevant at the price point. The lead over the 12400's 266 FPS average is 24%, which is actually noteworthy here, but it's a rarity, and it's largely relegated to this one game. But it's still a real result, and AMD gets credit for a real lead where they occur. At 1440p, AMD's CPUs remain basically in the same place. The i5-12400 is still at 266 FPS average as well. The 5600 remains at about 330, and the spacing is the same between all of these parts. That's because we're not GPU bound enough to impose limitations and impact scaling on these. Red Dead Redemption 2 has typically been the opposite, and up until the Ryzen 5000 series, it was a last bastion for Intel. In fact, it was the only game Intel could win in for a generation there, but the 12th gen CPUs have reclaimed parts of that territory. The R5 5600 ran at 165 FPS average, just below our result for the 5600X, so they're about the same. The 5800X only offered a 3.4% lead, while the 12400 posted a 4.8% lead over the R5 5600 and 5600X CPUs. We'll be interested to see where our 5700X lands in our upcoming review, so be sure to subscribe to catch that one the next day or so. Far Cry 6 is next. As a reminder, in Windows 10, the 12600K has trouble with task scheduling for its E-cores in this specific game. That subsides in our Windows 11 testing we've done in the past, but it does reflect in our data here because we're still using Windows 10 for CPU reviews. In Far Cry 6 at 1080p, the R5-5600 ran at 127 FPS average compared to about 129 FPS average on the R5-5600X. The $30 X here gets you 1.6% more performance, once again showing the true value of a gaming grade letter. Not just any letter can be gaming grade, mind you. For example, the letter A is strictly banned from gaming product suffixes in 47 states. The i5-12400 leads the R5-5600 non-X by 4.7%, contributing to an overall small but mostly consistent lead, at least mostly aside from CSGO's results earlier. Just for reference, the R5-3600 ran at 106 FPS average here, allowing a 19% lead for the R5-5600. We're moving to production workloads now. These are heavier workloads. They typically bind the cores a little more than in some of the games we've tested, and they're the most useful for people who might mix in some kind of work alongside their gaming. We'll start with Blender Cycles Rendering. This is a tile-based renderer that spawns one tile per thread present. The scaling is generally linear, or pretty close to it for each physical core, and it's typically closer to 30% improvement for logical threads. The R5-5600X required 21.9 minutes to complete this render previously. That means that the 5600X finished the render in 2.2% less time than the R5-5600 non-X's 22.4 minute result. That 2% aligns with what we're seeing in most of the games as well. As for the i5-12400, it's about equal to the R5-5600 non-X. There's no distinct advantage between them for this task, so it's not a tiebreaker, this result, between the rest of the results. As always, the higher core count CPUs would be more advisable for users doing frequent or daily rendering work, especially if you're doing it professionally where it might affect your ability to complete projects quickly and make more money. But the R5-5600 and 5600X alike, and the i5-12400 for that matter, are all about where we draw the line as an acceptable, moderately capable, but cheaper solution than something like the higher core count CPUs. Once you start falling below this category, it starts to slow down a lot. Our next test is Adobe Premiere. This test evaluates the render time, the scrubbing and playback performance, filter and mask application, and more. Unfortunately, it does not have a benchmark for crashes per second, which is the most valuable Premiere metric. Also, unfortunately, Adobe hasn't yet gotten the memo that lower is better for crashes per second, not higher. Scored in aggregate points, the R5-5600 ended up at 706 points for Premiere, which has it about equal to the much older R7-2700X. The R5-5600X's 728 points has it 3% ahead of the R5-5600, an unremarkable lead that matches what we've seen pretty much everywhere else. The i5-12400 is below the R5-5600 in this one, and actually also below the 2700X a bit, allowing the R5-5600 a 2.5% lead. That's not significant, but each lead starts to stack towards an overall sort of victory or loss for one of these CPUs, despite what is functionally a tie in many ways. In Adobe Photoshop, tested the same way and represented an aggregate points for score, the R5 5600 ended up at 1,047 points versus the 5600X at 1,079 points, where the $30 X gets you a 3% lead. The i5-12400 is between the two, but more comparable to the R5 5600X and within error of it. The lead over the 5600 non-X is outside of error, but it's also not noticeable, and since this is a benchmark, it's going to change task to task depending on what you're doing. This counters the 5600's insignificant lead in the previous test though, so the 12400 and the 5600 are trading back and forth. The next test is for Chromium code compile, representing the time required to compile the Chromium code base. In this test, the AMD R5 5600 required 108 minutes to compile, with the 5600X reducing that by 1.1%. The i5-12400 boosts ahead more notably here, leading the R5 5600 with a 10% time reduction to render. For perspective, the R5 5600 leads the older AMD R5 3600 by only 1.2%. We see better gains generationally between these two in gaming, where we're in double-digit percentage increases for the newer generation. So obviously, as always, the type of workload you're doing severely affects how much an upgrade or a CPU change actually impacts the performance. Compression and decompression testing are next, using 7-zip as the test vehicle. The results are shown in millions of instructions per second, or MIPS, with higher being better. The architectures tend to diverge between these two tests, making it more interesting as a tool to evaluate the performance overall. In compression, the 5600X and 5600 are about the same, with the 5600X technically leading by 2% once again. The 5600 has a 12% lead over the i5-12400, which is more noteworthy than some of the other tests. The generational improvement for the R5 56 versus 3600 non-X CPUs is also noteworthy, at 19% ahead. For most, that's not enough of a jump to warrant a new expense. The 3600 is still a good CPU, but it may become more worth considering as the parts age, and maybe the 5600 goes to the used market later, where in the very least, you could have a good in-socket upgrade if you're not stepping up higher. In decompression, the 5600 and 5600X separated by 1.5%, so no change. The lead over the i5-12400, however, is massive. AMD jumps 46% ahead, consistent with the loss of rank by other Intel CPUs in this test. We also saw generational regression in this one for Intel in some instances, and this is something that has followed the trend as Intel has worked to secure its CPUs and the patches for previous vulnerabilities have rolled out. Power consumption is last. In a Blender all-core workload, the AMD R5 5600 pulled about the same power as the 5600X. That means that the 5600X remains overall efficient, especially since it's about 200 MHz higher in advertised clocks. But it also means it's potentially binned for that better efficiency. This doesn't really become that big of a turning point though unless you're buying very high-end for overclocking. Compared to the i5-12400, AMD is more efficient in its results. That's its clearest advantage thus far. The 12400, for example, pulls about 15% more power than the 5600 in Blender. Meanwhile, the two had equal render performance times in the same application. So that's a distinct advantage for the 5600. Additionally, this is measured with tau limits having expired on Intel, so Intel will run hotter on boards that pre-configure tau past Intel official guidance, though that's mostly the motherboard manufacturers doing stupid things for marketing, not Intel. In multi-threaded power consumption testing in Cinebench, the R5 5600 pulled the same power, 65 watts, with the i5-12400 now pulling 87.6 watts during its short window for higher power consumption. This is so short, though, that it's not really relevant overall, but it would become relevant, or a much bigger issue, when using boards that ignore those limits, and you might even have to buy a higher-end cooler. Overall, then, $200 is a much more favorable price for this class of CPU. So if this launched originally, the reviews would have been very similar to the past 3 launches of these AMD R5 X600 CPUs, where we would have just said, skip the 5600X and go for the 5600, save the $100 in that instance if it happened that way, and spend it on literally anything else on the computer instead, or just keep it. But $100 extra at that point towards a GPU or something, that's a big deal, even in this market. So now the price is $30. We're still going to say save the money. It's a little bit better, yes, with the 5600X. You're looking at a couple percent in most instances. Maybe it stretches up to 4 sometimes. We didn't find anything where it went as high as 5%. So you're looking at, on average, like a 1.5 to maybe 3% range of difference favoring the 5600X. Our opinion on that, not worth it. The 5600X is, at this point, more or less just outdone for value by the 5600. The more interesting battle is the i5-12400 versus the 5600. At equivalent price, it's kind of a toss-up. That's not us being wishy-washy and trying to allow everyone to win in a very contentious battlefield of CPU manufacturers, but it's the fact of it, where there are few benchmarks where we saw more than a couple percent difference between the 5600 and the 12400. A couple of them, CSGO, had a massive advantage for AMD. Decompression benchmarking, massive advantage for AMD. So if you do decompression frequently, then, I mean, that's your answer. It's the 5600 if you're at this price point specifically. If you can't go up higher, if you do, you should still stick with AMD for this specific benchmark. Now, if decompression doesn't mean anything to you, it's not a workload you do frequently, you can kind of ignore that metric. If CSGO isn't something you do frequently, you can ignore that metric too. Otherwise, that's your choice. Once again, very clear. For Intel, there aren't as many of those sort of scenarios. There's one or two where it's got a 10% advantage or so, but typically the difference is closer to 2.5 to 4% if the 12400 is in a lead. And the 12500 we can ignore. It adds a couple more percent sometimes, but otherwise not really that worth considering. So whenever this happens, where the CPUs are pretty head-to-head between two competitors, first of all, that's great. That means that, and we had this happen in our Micro Center video, which you should check out if you haven't. Really fun, where we worked with a random viewer in the store and helped him build his first computer. But in that video, that was a fantastic reminder for me as a reviewer of why, if it wasn't already obvious, competition is so good. Because this particular viewer wanted, originally, he came in, he wanted an AMD CPU. He decided he wanted an Intel CPU after learning more about the 12,000 series. We were unable to source him a DDR4 motherboard in the store that he could work with that night. And so we went back to AMD because AMD had DDR4 boards available, and you didn't have to deal with $600 for like 32 gigabytes of DDR5 at 4400 for the speed, which is terrible. And so that was awesome because it means that AMD and Intel are close enough where if you can't get one, it's not available, the other options for the board and the ancillary features are poorly priced or not available, then you have a direct competitor where it doesn't feel like you're having your soul ripped out of you for having to move over to it. In other words, it's not a big compromise to go from one to the other. So that's good. So then what that leaves us with is your primary comparison for these CPUs really more comes down to the motherboards that you have available to you and the memory. Intel theoretically has another step, another generation, probably the 13 series, that will work, at least as they say, in the Z690 motherboards. And probably the non-Z series boards in this generation as well. So in that instance, you have one more step. If in-socket upgrades are something you think you'll do, I think a lot of people will probably say they will and then end up using their computer for much longer than they anticipated and probably just build a new one. But if you're someone who you're pretty confident you'll do an in-socket upgrade later, you'll have more room to grow with Intel, but not much, than AMD. AMD will have the X3D coming out for the 5800 specifically. We don't think there'll be any others, maybe. So that'll be your only real future upgrade option. Of course, you could always upgrade to 5900, 5950, whatever. But in those instances, it's not generational, of course. And then if you're on an existing AMD board, the X370 boards, at least some of them, or a good amount of them now, will support the 5000 series. So you do have the option of going to this newer 5600 if you're on, say, a 3300X or 3100 or a 2600. This would be a reasonable upgrade for you if you already have the whole platform. So that's how we would look at this. If you're on pretty old AMD Ryzen, the 5600 may be a worthwhile consideration for you as an in-socket upgrade, save a whole bunch of money on everything else. If you think the extra, let's say 20%, versus a 3600 in some of these games, it goes up obviously depending on the game. If you think that's worth it, then that's where it makes sense. It's directly competitive with the 12400, and we don't have a strong preference between the two, but these benchmarks, at least in production, at least for what we're testing, look to favor AMD, like in decompression. In gaming, you get DDR5, so there's that to consider with Intel, but not with AMD. But for the most part, it's inaccessible in price right now anyway, especially for someone spending $200 on a CPU. It doesn't make sense to blow your budget on memory. You'd be far better served just buying a better CPU with that price difference in the memory instead. So then, fairly competitive. This knocks the 5600X out of consideration for us by and large. We would just say get the 5600 instead. And otherwise, it's back and forth on the 12.4 and the 56 for things like gaming benchmarks, very close. So realistically, not a huge difference in those scenarios. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. We have the 5700X, 5500, and probably the 4500 reviews coming up next. They'll be on the channel very soon, so make sure you subscribe. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net. If you would like to support us directly, like by grabbing our teardown toolkits, which we've just recently added a 7-year retroactive warranty to. So it applies backwards as well. If you want to support us and the work we do, that's a great way to do it. And we'll see you all next time.